Daylight scorched the Mojave as if it wanted to burn the sky itself. A mother German shepherd lay half buried in the sand, her leg caught tight in a steel trap. 3 newborn pups clung to her ribs, barely alive, and still, she tried to shield them from the sun. When the old veteran saw them, he didn't move for a long time. Then he whispered, "You've done your part. Now it's my turn." They say the old soldier once saved men under fire. Now he was fighting the desert itself, with one hand, one canteen, and a promise he had never spoken aloud. He stepped closer to the mother dog. So the question is, when the world turns its back on life still fighting to survive, what would you do? Before we begin, hit like, share this story, and subscribe. And tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Because I wonder how far a story of mercy can travel across this burning world. The Mojave sun did not rise that morning. It fell. Like molten glass poured over the land, it burned through the horizon until everything shimmered in white fire. The air trembled. Even the flies had given up pretending to live. There were no shadows here, only outlines of what once existed. A man walked alone between them, Raymond Cole, 55, a veteran whose boots carried more dust than miles. His olive field jacket was faded, the fabric stiff from salt and sun. Beneath his hat, his eyes were the color of gunmetal, quiet, guarded, and hollowed by years of remembering too much. He had come to this wasteland not to be found, but to finally disappear. The war had ended a decade ago, but the war inside him had not. The static of his old radio crackled like ghosts calling names he couldn't forget. A photo, creased and yellowing, was tucked inside his breast pocket, showing a younger man standing beside a woman who once smiled like she believed in forever. He hadn't looked at it in months. In this desert, even memory felt too loud. He followed no road, just the lines of wind-carved stone and broken fences that led nowhere. Each step was a conversation with silence, each breath a truce with the heat. "The desert's quiet," he muttered under his breath, "but never kind." The words vanished in the wind as if the earth refused to remember them. Then it happened, so faint he almost dismissed it. A sound that didn't belong to the desert, not the wind, not the radio. A whimper. Raymond froze. The sound came again, trembling and soft, from beyond a ridge of shattered rock. Instinct, older than thought, pulled him forward. His boots crushed the brittle sand, breath shallow as he climbed over the rise. The sun flared in his eyes, and for a moment everything blurred into light. Then the light parted, and he saw it. Half buried in sand lay a German shepherd, her coat once golden now streaked with dust and blood. A steel trap clamped her foreleg, the metal glinting like a cruel joke beneath the sun. Her ribs rose and fell in shallow tremors. Beneath her, 3 newborn pups pressed against her chest, tiny, dark, and nearly still. For a long time, Raymond didn't move. He had seen this shape before, on battlefields, in craters, in doorways turned to ash. Mothers shielding what the world had already taken. He could almost smell the cordite and hear the scream that once followed every silence. He dropped to his knees, the heat biting through his jeans. The mother dog lifted her head, baring her teeth weakly, not out of anger, but from fear. Her eyes were fierce amber, wide and unblinking, locked onto his. There was no plea in them, only a command. "Do something." His voice cracked as he whispered, "Easy now. You've done your part." He reached for his canteen, unscrewed the cap, and poured a thin stream of water into his palm. The mother hesitated, then licked once, twice before nudging the smallest pup closer to shade. Even half dying, she protected. Something inside Raymond shifted. The tremor in his hands, the one that had haunted him since the war, stilled. He found a flat stone, wedged it between the trap's jaws, and pressed down with all his weight. Metal screamed. His breath came out in grunts. Then, snap, the hinge released. The dog didn't cry out. She just collapsed forward, exhausted. Blood soaked the sand, spreading dark beneath her paw. Raymond ripped a strip from his sleeve and wrapped it tight around the wound. His movements were automatic, efficient, like dressing a wound on the field. Only this time the enemy was silence itself. The pups stirred. One squeaked, another kicked feebly. He cupped his hands around them, feeling the fragile warmth of life. The desert wind swept past, soft now, almost reverent. For the first time in years, Raymond wasn't fighting a memory. He was fighting for something real. He looked at the mother again. Her breathing was ragged but steady. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat he saw himself, not as the soldier who survived, but as the man who might still deserve to. "You hold on now," he said softly, voice thick with dust and mercy. The sun began to fall behind the ridge, turning the sky to the color of old brass. Long shadows stretched across the sand until man and animal were no longer two figures, but one shape, fused by the fading light. If anyone had been watching from afar, they would have seen a soldier kneeling in the middle of an endless desert, and a mother dog too weak to move. Two broken creatures who had no reason left to trust, and yet somehow did. And in that stillness, the Mojave fell silent, as if the world itself had paused to remember what mercy looked like. The trap's hinge snapped beneath Raymond's weight, the sound slicing through the desert like a gunshot from another lifetime. The mother's cry followed, raw and trembling, echoing off the dry walls of the canyon until even the wind seemed to stop and listen. Raymond pressed his hand against her leg, blood hot beneath his palm, and tore a strip from his sleeve, wrapping it tight around the wound. He could feel her pulse, weak but refusing to quit. With a grunt, he slid his arms beneath her ribs, lifted all 60 pounds of muscle and pain, and rose to his feet. The pups whimpered as he gathered them into the folds of his shirt, 3 tiny bundles of heat and silence. Step by step, he carried them through the staggering shimmer of the Mojave, every breath scraping like gravel in his chest. The horizon blurred into liquid gold. His truck waited half buried in sand, metal burning to the touch. He opened the door with his elbow, lowered the mother onto the seat, then cradled the pups beside her, whispering words neither of them could understand. The drive was a slow crawl through a land that no longer wanted life. The tires groaned over cracked dirt roads, the steering wheel slick with sweat. Raymond's knuckles were white against it, jaw tight, eyes flicking to the rearview mirror as if afraid something unseen might follow. When he finally saw the faint outline of his cabin, it looked less like salvation and more like a question the desert had forgotten to answer. The old cabin sat hunched beneath a dead Joshua tree, its roof warped, its porch sagging like an old man's back. Inside, the air was stale with dust and memory, but tonight, it would have to become something it hadn't been in years, a shelter. Raymond spread a worn wool blanket across the floor, the same one that once covered him through winter storms. He set the mother down gently, her breathing fast, pupils wide, chest rising like a bellows. The pups clung to her belly, eyes still sealed shut, making soft sounds that filled the silence with a fragile kind of life. He boiled water on a rusted camping stove, the blue flame licking the bottom of an old tin pot. The smell of metal and heat brought back flashes of field tents, morphine, and sandbags. He moved like a medic again. Steady hands, measured breath, words low and careful. "Easy now," he murmured, dabbing at the wound, stitching torn flesh with a piece of fishing line he'd found in his gear. Each loop of the thread pulled something in him tighter. Not just the wound before him, but the one inside that had never quite healed. When he finished, he sat back on his heels, exhausted. The dog lay still, but her gaze never left him. Those eyes, amber and alive, flickered between defiance and trust, as if daring him to stop caring. "Maxine," he said suddenly, the name rising from nowhere, tasting strange and right all at once. The sound made her ears twitch. "Max, then," he corrected softly, almost smiling. "You look like a fighter." Hours crawled past. The heat outside dissolved into a darkness that hummed with crickets and far-off engines. Raymond poured a small bowl of water, coaxing Max to drink. She obeyed, slow and deliberate, then licked one of the pups that squealed too loudly. For a time the cabin filled with rhythm, the rasp of her breathing, the soft suckling of the pups, the faint crackle of the stove. For the first time in years, the silence didn't hurt. It carried weight now. It was the sound of survival. But mercy has its price. When the smallest pup went still, Raymond didn't notice at first. The movement had been fading for hours, small, stuttering, fragile. Then Max shifted, pushing the limp body toward him with her nose. Her eyes caught his, hard and clear. It wasn't a plea. It was an order. Raymond froze, his chest constricted, an old reflex tightening in his ribs. He reached out, hands that once held pressure on bullet wounds, now trembling over a body that barely filled his palm. "Come on, kid," he muttered, voice breaking like dry wood. "Don't give up now." He pressed 2 fingers against the pup's ribs, began to work by instinct. Compressions, breath, pause again. The rhythm came back to him like a hymn he'd forgotten he knew. For a long time, nothing happened. Then a twitch, a faint gasp, small but defiant, like a spark refusing to die. The pup jerked, coughed, and a thin sound escaped. Half cry, half breath. Raymond exhaled, half laugh, half sob, and leaned back against the wall. Max watched him, eyes glistening, then pulled the pup back into her embrace. Outside, the desert wind shifted direction. The night grew cooler, and through a crack in the roof, the first stars appeared. Sharp, steady, distant. Raymond looked at his hands, at the blood and dirt caked beneath his nails, and realized something had changed. A part of him long dead had begun to move again, slow and deliberate, like an old clock remembering time. He sat beside Max, poured the last of his canteen into a tin bowl, and stared into the flame of the camping stove until it burned low. The cabin smelled of smoke, antiseptic, and breath, familiar scents of life that refused to yield. For a moment, he let himself feel it, the quiet satisfaction of saving something no one else would have noticed. Then, faintly, came another sound, distant, mechanical, a low hum growing louder across the valley. He rose, moved to the window, and parted the curtain. Headlights sliced through the dark, bouncing off the sand like white ghosts. A truck was coming, the seal of the county stenciled faintly on its door. Raymond's jaw tightened. He looked back at Max and the pups sleeping in a pile of warmth and trust. The air in the cabin thickened. Outside, the desert seemed to hold its breath. Mercy had brought them together. But mercy never came without a shadow. Morning arrived like judgment, bright, merciless, and without apology. The Mojave had a way of turning dawn into interrogation light, and when Raymond stepped out of the cabin, he saw it flashing from a polished badge. The man wearing it stood squarely in the doorway, one hand resting on his belt, the other shading his eyes from the glare. Sheriff Marcus Danner wasn't a stranger to the desert, nor to the kind of silence that followed when people broke rules meant to be unbroken. He was older than the hills, built like they were too, broad, weathered, immovable. His tan uniform bore years of dust and sun, his hat shadowing a face carved by decades of doing what was necessary. The lines around his mouth were deep, the color of old scars. His boots clicked once against the wooden porch as his gaze swept over the scene inside. Bandages. Blood. A mother dog breathing shallow on a wool blanket. 3 trembling pups pressed against her side. Danner's jaw tightened. His voice came out low, slow, and solid. Unregistered animal. Wild breed. Wounded. You know what that means. Raymond didn't answer. He just stood there, one shoulder leaning against the doorframe, eyes dark beneath the brim of his hat. He'd spent too many years obeying orders that didn't deserve obedience. He recognized the tone, the kind that sounded like law but felt like a sentence. The silence between them was thick enough to burn. The sheriff's radio crackled on his hip. A dispatcher's voice tried to cut in, asking for location. Danner reached down, flicked it off. The static died, leaving only the hiss of the wind. "You've got 48 hours, Cole," he said flatly. "Make her legal, or I come back with animal control." Raymond's mouth twitched, not in defiance, but in memory. 48 hours. He'd been given deadlines before. Sometimes it meant evacuation. Sometimes it meant death. And sometimes it meant a chance to do something human before the world remembered its rules. The sheriff turned to leave. His boots hit the dirt hard, dust curling around his legs like smoke. "You always had a good record, Cole," he said without turning. "Don't ruin it on a damn stray." The door swung shut behind him with a hollow thud that echoed long after his truck started down the ridge. Inside, the cabin exhaled. Max was standing now, wobbly, balancing on 3 legs, her ears low but her gaze fixed toward the door. The growl that rose from her chest wasn't meant for the sheriff. It was meant for the silence he left behind. Raymond knelt beside her, running a hand down her back. Her muscles quivered under his touch, but her eyes remained fierce. "You're not the only one tired of being told what to do," he murmured. She leaned her head into his palm, breath hot and ragged. The pups shifted restlessly on the blanket, one of them squealing softly. The sound reminded him of something simple, something worth disobeying for. The day stretched long. Raymond spent the morning outside, fixing the truck's cracked radiator with the same calm he once used to clean rifles. Every few minutes he glanced toward the cabin door. The horizon shimmered with heat, but the sheriff's words echoed louder than the wind. 48 hours. The desert wasn't counting time, but he was. He tried the local line on the radio. Dead. The phone line, too. Out here, the only things that still worked were engines and conscience, and he wasn't sure which would run longer. He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had once carried orders carved in blood. Maybe this time, they'd carry something cleaner. By afternoon, Max limped to the open doorway. The sun caught her fur, turning the dust into gold around her shoulders. She didn't bark, but her eyes said everything. She was ready to move. Raymond understood. Staying meant surrender. and surrender was something his body no longer remembered how to do. He gathered what he had: a rucksack, a field knife, a blanket, a few cans of food. The pups were placed inside the old army jacket, their small heads poking out like pieces of fragile warmth. He took one last look at the cabin, its walls scorched by memory. Once, it had been his refuge. Now it was a line he couldn't cross again. As dusk approached, the sky bruised into violet and copper. The desert wind carried the scent of iron and sage. Raymond cinched the straps of his bag, slung it over his shoulder, and gave Max a soft nod. "Come on, girl," he said quietly. "We've been given our orders." She followed, limping but determined, her shadow long beside his. The pups stirred inside the pack, their faint squeaks lost beneath the rising wind. Behind them, the cabin shrank to a dot swallowed by the dunes. Ahead, the desert opened wide, endless, indifferent, waiting. Night came fast in the Mojave. The wind rose like a ghost, whipping sand into spirals that danced around their feet. Raymond's face was set, not in fear, but resolve. The man who once followed commands was disobeying again. But this time, it wasn't war that drove him. It was something harder to explain, something that didn't need medals or witnesses. It was mercy. And mercy, he knew now, was worth running for. The desert night was a place without mercy. Wind swept over the dunes in long, whispering howls, carving the sand into restless shapes. Each step sank deep, heavy, slow. Raymond's boots cracked the silence with dull thuds, his breath forming small ghosts in the cold air. The moon was pale and unkind, staring down at a man who had chosen defiance over safety. He carried his rucksack high, careful not to jostle the tiny lives nestled inside. Behind him limped Max, her chestnut coat dull under the starlight, one paw dragging slightly in the sand. The bandage around her leg was dark with dust, but she kept her head low, pushing forward. Once, twice she stumbled, collapsing to her side. The wind screamed, lifting a veil of sand over her, but through the swirling haze, she could still hear the faint squeaks from Raymond's pack. The sound of her pups pulled her up again. 5 miles. That was what the map had promised. 5 miles to an old ranger outpost, long forgotten by men, marked only by a faded cross in the corner of a torn military chart. Raymond pressed on through the cutting wind, shoulders hunched, his mind counting each step like prayer beads. The desert was no longer a place. It was a test, one measured not in distance, but in endurance. By the time dawn broke, the horizon bled into copper. The outpost appeared like a ghost, half buried in dunes, walls cracked, its roof caved in at one corner. A rusted sign still clung to a post, U.S. Ranger Station 14. The letters were barely legible. Raymond forced the warped door open with his shoulder, sand spilling in like water. The place smelled of stone, rust, and abandonment. He laid the pups down first, on a patch of cloth torn from his coat. Then he unwrapped Max's bandage, cleaned her leg with what little water remained, and wrapped it again using the last of his gauze. She watched him silently, her amber eyes soft now, exhaustion flickering behind the fire that had once burned there. He touched her muzzle lightly. "You did good, girl," he whispered, and for a brief second, her tail brushed against the floor. Outside, the sky began to darken again, unnatural for morning. The wind shifted, the air thickening with static and grit. Raymond stepped out to scan the horizon, his body stiffening as the first hiss of sand lifted like steam from the ground. The desert was moving. The storm wasn't approaching. It was rising. By the time he re-entered the hut, the light had vanished. Sand beat against the windows like rain made of knives. The sound built and built until it became a single, roaring wall of fury. Max barked once, sharp and low, her ears flattened. Raymond threw himself against the door, forcing it shut as dust poured in through every crack. "Stay down!" he shouted, though his voice was swallowed by the wind. He gathered the pups closer to Max, pressing them under a blanket, his hand trembling as he covered her head. Then the roof began to moan. Boards groaned, nails shrieked, and a piece of the ceiling gave way. Sand poured through the opening, stinging his face and eyes. He shouted her name, "Max!" But the storm devoured it. The world turned to chaos, a vortex of sand and darkness, the sound of the earth collapsing in on itself. When it ended without warning. The storm moved on as suddenly as it had come, leaving behind only the rattle of shifting grains. Raymond woke to silence. Thick, suffocating silence. The roof above him was half gone, daylight leaking through a hole that once was wood. He sat up slowly, the taste of dust on his tongue, and looked around. The floor was gone beneath a mound of sand. The blanket, the pups. Max. "Max!" His voice cracked raw. No answer. He dropped to his knees, clawing at the sand with bare hands. Each handful came away wet with blood and grit. His nails split, skin tore open. Still, he dug. He dug until the world narrowed to breath and pain and the desperate rhythm of his heart. Then, he saw her. Max lay curled against the wall, half buried, her body curved protectively around the pups. Her coat was coated in dust, eyes closed, her breath invisible. The pups were alive, faint cries rising from beneath her chest. But she was still, motionless, her head resting on the ground like sleep had come too easily. Raymond pressed his palm against her ribs. Nothing. Then, faint. One shallow breath, another. He froze, tears streaking through the dust on his face. "Good girl," he whispered hoarsely. "Don't quit on me now." The soldier inside him came back, not the one trained to fight, but the one who refused to lose. He tore his jacket open, wrapped her body tight, lifted her in his arms. The pups he tucked inside his coat, pressed against his chest for warmth. The wind outside was still raging in the distance, a ghost circling the dunes, but he stepped into it anyway. Every step sank deep, his legs trembling, but his grip did not loosen. The desert stretched endless, no compass, no sound, but the rasp of his breath and the hiss of shifting sand. The sky was bruised gray, the sun a dull white coin behind clouds of grit. Raymond's body screamed with exhaustion, but something older, something stubborn, kept him moving. He didn't look back at the outpost. It no longer existed. The storm had claimed it, sealing it under dunes that would never tell its story. He was the only witness left. Hours passed. His shoulders bled where the straps bit into his skin, his throat raw from shouting her name into wind that never answered. Still, he walked. Step after step, dragging a body that weighed more in meaning than in flesh. A man against a desert that didn't care if he lived or not, carrying a wounded creature that still believed in life. By the time the sun broke through the haze again, Raymond could see the faint rise of the hills where his cabin waited, small, fragile, still standing. His knees buckled once, twice, but he pressed on. Behind him, the storm began to settle. The dunes shifted, the wind sighed, and the buried outpost vanished completely. The ground where it once stood sank inward, silent, hollow, like a grave. Raymond didn't see it. He was still walking, his eyes fixed on the fading light ahead. The desert had taken nearly everything from him once. But not this time. This time he was taking something back. By the time the cabin came into sight, it was more mirage than memory, a blur of wood and smoke on the horizon. Raymond's steps were uneven now, his knees buckling with every few yards, breath scraping through a throat lined with dust. The bundle in his arms felt heavier than his own body, yet somehow lighter than guilt. When he reached the porch, the last of his strength dissolved. He fell to his knees, clutching Max close as if the world might take her if he let go. Her breath was shallow, her fur caked in salt and grit, her body limp against his chest. He pushed through the door, shoulder first, nearly collapsing with the weight of her. The room was dark and cold, the kind of cold that made the air itself ache. With trembling fingers, he tore through old crates, yanked down a broken chair, and fed the splinters into the stove. The fire caught fast, roaring up in a flash of orange and gold. It wasn't warmth, it was defiance. The blaze filled the room with a sound like artillery, fierce, alive, demanding. Raymond stripped off his coat, wrapped it around Max, and began rubbing her sides with his rough palms, pushing heat into flesh that refused to answer. "Come on, girl," he whispered, voice raw. "You've come too far." The pups lay beside the stove, no larger than his hands, their bodies twitching faintly, breaths uneven. He found an old tin pot, poured what was left of the milk powder he'd stored for himself, mixed it with warm water from the kettle. Drop by drop, he fed them through a spoon handle wrapped in cloth. Tiny tongues flickered weakly against the metal. One blinked, one whimpered, then silence again. He kept talking, to them, to her, to no one. Words turned into fragments, memories, pieces of songs he half remembered from nights in the field. "You know," he murmured to Max, "I once thought mercy was weakness. Maybe I was wrong." His voice cracked on the last word. Hours blurred into something without measure. The fire roared, faded, then grew again as he fed it with whatever wood or cloth he could find. The storm outside had calmed, but inside, another storm raged, of memory, of hope, of something too fragile to name. Raymond's eyes burned. Sleep taunted him from the edge of consciousness, but he fought it, whispering to stay awake, to keep count of the breaths beside him. Then a sound, a faint, broken yelp. Then another. Raymond's head snapped up, heart slamming against his ribs. One of the pups had rolled over, mouth open, squeaking for warmth. Then a second. All three were moving now, blindly crawling toward each other, their fur damp with life. He laughed, a sound strange to his throat, hoarse and bright all at once. He turned to Max. Her chest didn't rise at first. Then, slowly, it did. Her eyes opened, reflecting the firelight. Those same sharp amber eyes that had once defied the sheriff, the storm, the trap. They fixed on him, steady and knowing. She didn't bark. She didn't move. She just saw him, the man behind the wounds, the one who stayed when everyone else had left. "Welcome back," he whispered. For the first time in years, Raymond Cole smiled, not as a soldier, not as a ghost, but as a man who had chosen to care. The hours that followed melted into quiet. He tended the pups, mended their blanket, fed Max with broth from his canteen cap. She ate little, but she kept her gaze on him, as if memorizing the shape of his breath. Outside, dawn crept across the sand, painting the cabin in pale gold. The world had burned and buried them, and somehow they'd still returned. The knock came around noon. A slow, deliberate rhythm, 3 taps, pause, 2 more. Raymond stiffened, instinct flicking back into him like a switch. He opened the door and saw the gleam of brass. Sheriff Marcus Danner stood there, hat low, eyes shaded against the light. The desert had etched new lines into his face overnight, and his jacket was dusted in the same sand Raymond had just escaped. He didn't speak at first. His gaze swept the room, the patched wounds, the fire still burning, the pups clustered near the stove. Then it found Max. She was standing now on 3 legs, her head lifted high. The sheriff exhaled slowly. "You've made a mess, Cole." Raymond wiped his hands on his jeans, nodding once. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but it's the kind that breathes." For a long moment, neither man moved. The fire popped, a single spark leaping into the air and dying before it touched the ground. Finally, Danner reached up, removed his hat, and ran a hand through his graying hair. His eyes softened, just enough to show the man beneath the badge. "There's a rescue up north," he said. "Mountain Shepherd Foundation. They'll take her in. No kill. No cages." Raymond's jaw tightened. "And the pups?" "They go with her," Danner replied. "That's what family means, right?" Silence fell again. But this time, it was a gentler one. A silence that carried forgiveness, not fear. The sheriff took one step forward, looking at Max. She met his gaze squarely, unflinching. For the first time since he'd arrived, he smiled. A small, worn thing, but real. "You picked a stubborn one, Cole." Raymond chuckled under his breath. "She picked me." The sheriff nodded, placing his hat back on. "Well," he said, turning toward the door, "for what it's worth, I think you both made the right kind of trouble." He left without another word. The sound of his truck faded into the desert wind. Inside, Raymond crouched down beside Max. The pups stirred against her, tiny whimpers filling the air. He brushed the ashes from her fur, hand steady, eyes damp. The firelight danced across the walls, soft and gold now, no longer the wild blaze it had been. He looked around the cabin, at the wreck, the dirt, the warmth, and realized something. For the first time in years, this place felt alive. Outside, the sun hung high, and for once it didn't burn. 4 months had passed, and the Mojave was no longer the wasteland it had once been. The winds had quieted, the cruel edges of the dunes softened by a carpet of wildflowers that rose defiantly from the sand. Bright marigolds, sunbursts of yellow and white, stubborn proof that even the deadest soil could learn to bloom again. The air no longer burned. It shimmered, alive with heat and memory. Raymond Cole drove north that morning, his old pickup rattling down a dirt road that wove between sagebrush and faded telephone poles. The desert sun no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like a companion that had watched him fall apart and helped him stand again. He wore his same flannel shirt, threadbare and faded, sleeves rolled up over tanned arms marked by scars and years. The brim of his hat shaded eyes that had once looked hollow, but now held the calm of a man who had made peace with his ghosts. When the ranch fence came into view, he cut the engine. The silence that followed was full, like the pause between heartbeats. Beyond the wooden posts and wire, the field stretched open and green, dotted with patches of wild mustard and the last of the spring bloom. A sign read, Mountain Shepherd Foundation, the place Sheriff Danner had told him about. Raymond stepped out, boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. He let the door creak shut behind him, then lifted his fingers to his lips and whistled once, sharp and clear. For a moment, there was nothing. Only wind brushing through grass. Then, from across the fields, movement, 4 figures breaking into the sunlight. 3 small shapes raced ahead, bounding low to the ground, tails slicing through the air like joy made visible. Behind them came the fourth, larger, moving with a rhythm that was both uneven and graceful. A dance learned from pain, but carried with pride. Max. Her coat caught the sun, gold and silver at once, scars glinting like threads of light woven into her fur. She ran with 3 legs, but there was no weakness in her stride, only power. Her head lifted high, her amber eyes fixed on him, and when she reached him, she didn't bark or cry. She simply pressed her head against his chest, slow and firm as if to say, "I remember." Raymond knelt, his knees sinking into the dirt. His hands found her shoulders, her neck, her muzzle, feeling every line of healed skin, every breath of warmth. "You did it," he whispered. "You made it home." The 3 pups, no longer fragile bundles of fur, but young shepherds with bright eyes and endless energy, circled him, nipping at his sleeves, rolling in the dust, wrestling with the confidence of the living. One of the ranch volunteers, a young woman in her 20s with sunburned cheeks and straw-blonde hair tucked beneath a worn ball cap, leaned against the fence, watching. "They never forgot you," she said softly. Every truck that pulls in, she looks up. Her voice carried both admiration and understanding. Raymond smiled faintly, still kneeling, still lost in the sound of Max's breathing. "She's not the same dog I found," he said. The woman shook her head. "No, she's better." The words hung in the warm air like a benediction. Raymond rose slowly, brushing dust from his jeans. He watched the dogs tumble through the tall grass, their laughter, the only word that seemed to fit that wild joy, echoing through the open valley. The mother moved among them with patience, nudging one back toward the group when it strayed too far, pausing once to glance back at him. That glance, steady, fierce, forgiving, carried more truth than language ever could. He stood there for a long time, letting the sun draw beads of sweat on his brow, letting the air hum with the quiet rhythm of peace. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled, casting its shadow over the field like a passing thought. The desert had not changed its nature. It was still vast, still merciless, but it no longer felt empty. It felt earned. Sometimes, he thought, mercy wasn't about saving something else. It was about remembering what being alive was supposed to mean. Max barked once, sharp and playful, then limped back toward him, 3 pups following like living echoes. She stopped beside his boot, tilted her head, eyes bright beneath the fading sun. Raymond bent down and pressed his forehead against hers. The warmth between them said everything words could not. "The desert tried to break us," he murmured, "but it failed." Her tail swayed once, slow and steady. As he turned back toward his truck, the horizon burned gold, a line of fire that didn't destroy but renewed. He looked over his shoulder one last time. Max stood there in the fading light, framed by her 3 young ones, their fur glinting like new copper. The wind moved through the field, carrying the smell of sage and dust and life itself. Sometimes, the mercy we give returns not as gratitude, but as strength. And in that moment, Raymond realized that both he and the desert had remembered what mercy looked like. And it looked a lot like loyalty. Some stories don't end when the mission does. They linger in the quiet places of the heart, where memory turns into meaning. Maybe this one was never about the desert, or even about survival. Maybe it was about what happens when someone decides to care again, even when the world has stopped asking them to. Loyalty doesn't shout. It waits. It stays beside the broken through silence and storm, until the light finds a way back in. And mercy, real mercy, isn't soft. It takes courage to lift what's dying, to see worth where others see burden, to believe that kindness still matters when no one's watching. Somewhere out there are still men like Raymond Cole and souls like Max. They don't seek thanks. They just keep walking. Quiet, steady, leaving warmth in the places they once nearly froze. If you listen closely, the world is full of them. And maybe tonight, that's enough. Until the next story, take care of what's fragile and remember, even the smallest act of kindness can echo louder than the wind.